John Calvin, you'll remember from the story of Dani Taron, had set up in Geneva, from where his Protestant ideas were spread through much of northern Europe, notably the Reformed Church in the Netherlands, the Huguenots back in France, the Puritans in England, and the Presbyterians of Scotland. Inevitably, there would then be secondary passages for Calvin's ideas, perhaps most famously a group of Puritans who left England on the Mayflower in 1620, setting up a new life in New England. But just over a decade before that famous voyage, there had been another important movement of people taking with them the ideas of Calvin, this time into Ireland. Since Henry VIII in the 1540s, England had been trying to subdue the wild Irish as they saw them, although these conflicts would later intensify under his daughter Elizabeth I during an Irish fightback known as Tyrone's Rebellion or the 9-Year War, which was concluded in 1603. With that, many of the Irish Gaelic chiefs fled for continental Europe, and England now attempted to maintain order. The most troublesome region, from an England perspective that is, had been Ulster, in the north. It was almost entirely Gaelic, Catholic, and rural, deeply resistant to English control. Accordingly, the English devised a plan to transform the demographic, a settlement scheme known as the Plantation of Ulster, whereby families would be moved into the region under favourable terms, provided that they were loyal to the king, English-speaking and Protestant. Many of them came from southern Scotland. Accordingly, the ideas of John Calvin were now transported into Northern Ireland, where the Presbyterian Church remains that region's largest sect. The settlement scheme, which covered some 500,000 acres of Ulster's land and was accompanied by discriminatory clauses towards the local Catholic people, would set in play centuries of resentment and division in Northern Ireland. Dave Gallaher was born to one of these Scottish Presbyterian families in Ulster some 10 generations later in 1873. He was the 7th child of James and Maria Gallaher from Ramelton in County Donegal. But they would soon be on the move. For it just so happened that New Zealand authorities, who were just emerging from 10 years of war with the indigenous Maori peoples, were now trying to build up their sparsely populated country by encouraging their own special settlements, ideally married families, Protestant and with some capital. Indeed, with land having been removed from the Maori peoples, there were plenty of parallels with those original Scottish settlers entering Ulster all those generations before. And understandably, some of the same tensions remain to this day. New Zealand was, however, tough country, and the belief was that if groups came out together, their shared cultural community would help them to endure the challenges of a pioneer life. George Vesey Stewart was an Ulsterman who had already left Ireland for New Zealand, and he was now looking to establish one of those special settlements at Katikati in the Bay of Plenty, not far from Auckland. His target, Ulster Protestant families, whom he was promising land with magnificent soil and the finest climate under the British flag. Meanwhile, James Gallaher's drapery business back in Donegal was taking strain. And so the curious posters advertising New Zealand, which were popping up on Orange Order halls from 1874, were enticing, the opportunity for a much-needed fresh start. In 1878, alongside other Ulster Scot families, James and Maria Gallaher boarded the Lady Jocelyn in Belfast and sailed off to a new life together with their children, including, of course, the now 5-year-old Dave Gallaher. However, as was often the case in these types of schemes, South Africa's 1820 settlers are case in point, the land promised by George Vesey Stewart at Katikati proved not to be as idyllic as its description. Hilly and thick, tough to farm, which meant Dave's mother became the sole breadwinner on a teaching post. Sadly, she passed away in 1887, leaving the family destitute. Dave, who was just 13, now exited school to find work, while the greater family were soon lured from Katikati to the greater opportunities afforded by the city of Auckland. Here, as a 17-year-old, Dave Gallaher found work at the Auckland Farmers Freezing Company, where his daily handling of heavy carcasses saw him develop an upper body strength, which was beginning to show on the rugby field, where he was displaying considerable potential as a hooker for the local club Ponsonby. Dave would make his debut for Auckland as a 22-year-old in 1896, emerging as a regular in the team until the 1900 season. In 1901, however, the 27-year-old Gallaher enlisted for military service with the Mounted Rifles, which was heading to fight in the South African War, arriving in East London on March 14. This was about 6 months after Dani Taron had been killed, and so the formal phase of the war was already complete. Instead, Gallaher's 6th contingent made their way to the already captured city of Pretoria, from where they would be dispatched right across the Greater Transvaal in an attempt to round up those formidable Boer commandos. No easy task, of course, with many hours spent on horseback. "We have been all over South Africa pretty well, I believe," he wrote to his sister. "I have had a couple of close calls. One day I thought I would have to say goodbye to old New Zealand. But I had my usual luck, and so came out all right." Gallaher had been in the thick of it, at one point describing the dead and wounded who were laying all over the place. And yet this was a curious war, one which still carried remnants of chivalry. Gallaher spoke of having had Boer fighters in his sights, but not the heart to fire, for they were attempting to rescue their comrades. Gallaher's rugby prowess would see him selected to captain the New Zealand Forces team in South Africa, one which went on to win the competition held amongst the various British forces. In retrospect, this had been an early warning to the world of rugby. Gallaher resumed his rugby career back in Ponsonby in 1903, where he was in fine form, eventually selected to represent New Zealand, initially at hooker but soon shifting to wing forward, a position then unique to New Zealand, a flank of sort but which remained detached from the scrum. By 1904, he was part of an Auckland team which secured the first ever Ranfurly Shield, and in that same season he managed to beat the touring British Lions whilst playing for both Auckland and New Zealand. The following year, he was selected to captain the first official New Zealand rugby team on a tour of Mother Britain, the Originals. Being a labourer with only a primary school education, this appointment was indicative of how rugby in New Zealand had transcended class. The first game of that 1905 tour against Devon was expected to be tight. New Zealand trounced them 55 points to 4. A pattern was set for the tour as the New Zealanders, now referred to by the British press as the All Blacks, proceeded to dominate. Gallaher himself was pivotal as opposition teams struggled to counter New Zealand's unique position of wing forward. However, it was his leadership over that long tour which has been universally praised. Paul Verdon, who authored a book on All Black captains, draws a link between Dave Gallaher's leadership and his time fighting in the South African War. For Gallaher was a disciplinarian, quiet but hard and respected, qualities to this day so prevalent in the All Black jersey. The team only lost one game on that 35-match tour, and that, you'll remember, was to a tough Welsh team and a refereeing decision in which even today the only real consensus lies in the observation that the panting referee was a very long way from the point of controversy. Nonetheless, Gallaher, who as a principle never expressed a view on the referee, was magnanimous in defeat. The better team won, and I am content. That was all he offered. From Wales, the tour continued on to France, where they played one another for the very first time on New Year's Day of 1906. Rugby in France was still finding its feet, but they did manage to score 8 points against the mighty All Blacks, more than any other team on the entire tour. This has, over time, developed into a marvellous rivalry. The relentless All Blacks and the unpredictable French have played out some of the most memorable test matches in the history of the game, including the final of the first ever Rugby World Cup in 1987. Gallaher retired as a player following that grueling tour of 1906. He married Ellen Francis on his return to New Zealand and became an Auckland and All Black selector until 1916. By then he was 42 years old, and so the Boer War veteran was exempt, by account of his age, from conscription for the Great War, which was by then raging through Europe. Nonetheless, Gallaher signed up to fight, arriving in Britain on May the 2nd, 1917, although not missing the opportunity to organise a game of rugby in Cape Town on the way past. With his rank confirmed as sergeant, Gallaher fought at the Battle of Messines in Flanders in June of that year, before spending 2 months training for the looming offensive on Passchendaele. On the 4th of October 1917, in the midst of that offensive, Dave Gallaher's helmet was penetrated by shrapnel, and he was fatally wounded. This was, of course, a most horrific war. Any remaining chivalry had now been replaced by heavy machinery and disease and death on an extraordinary scale. 2 of his brothers were also killed in the war, and a third badly wounded at Gallipoli. 13 All Blacks would give their lives. In 1922, the Auckland Rugby Football Union introduced the Gallaher Shield for the winner of the Men's Premier Club competition, a trophy which his old club, Ponsonby, have won more than any other. You will also find a large bronze statue of Gallaher outside the All Black Fortress at Eden Park. On November 11th of the year 2000, New Zealand and France played a test match at Stade de France in Paris. Being Armistice Day, it was a fitting occasion on which to introduce a new piece of silverware for which France and the All Blacks continue to compete: the Dave Gallaher Trophy.